Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Native Radio. This week on our panel, we have Josh Justice.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Ram. And do you want to introduce yourself, Ram?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ram, and I am a software engineer at Facebook. I used to work on React Native, and these days my interests are captured by the Oculus headset. So I'm working on React VR and React Native, of course.
Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. Also check out Chain React, the React Native conference, which is hosted by Infinite Red in July in Portland with 500 developers from all around the world. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad.
Now, are you still at Microsoft? Is that what you said?
No, I'm at Facebook right now. I used to be at Microsoft working on Code Push, App Center and stuff, but a couple of years ago, I moved to Facebook to work on the React Native core team.
Nice. And now you're doing VR. So I'm going to tangent us just for a second. I've been working to try and get a VR, AR podcast together for developers specifically. So it's not just talking about, hey, what are the possibilities and, this pie in the sky futuristic stuff, but how do we build it? And so, yeah, I might pick your brain afterward and see if we can get something together to get you on that panel and see if we can get that one rolling.
Oh, sure. I'd love to talk. This is pretty much I'm super excited about these days. And you probably can't get me shut up talking about VR stuff.
Perfect. Those are the kinds of people I'm looking for. But in particular, I have this theory that AR and VR are basically one or two killer use cases away from just going mainstream. The technology's kind of gotten to the point where people can drop a couple $100 and get it. So I'm excited about that. So now it's just making it so that it's something that we can essentially carry around with us. Kind of like our phones, right? Smartphones are, in my opinion, a form of augmented reality. It's just not super convenient to use because you have to pull it out of your pocket and unlock it. Anyway, I can see that playing nicely with a lot of IoT applications where you then use it to interact with devices around. So that could be, smart home devices, or, if you're at a restaurant, you can essentially order with it or whatever. And then, because you have a device sitting on your table, and then taking advantage of AI and machine learning analytics. So you essentially learn, you can teach it to show you what you want to see. And so anyway, but that's, anyway, I've gone way off on my theories here, but I think it's a technology that's going to emerge here within the next couple of years. And it's going to be some form of, it's going to be a form factor change and then an application change that's going to open it up. What were we going to say, Josh?
Yeah, I have a follow-up VR question, and maybe we'll just do a VR podcast pilot here today. So Ram, you mentioned React VR, and I've been aware that that's been out there, but in my head, I know that React Native is also available for a number of different platforms like Windows. But in my head, when I look at the docs and I see the conversations, I hear most of the conversations about React Native for iOS and Android. And so maybe you could fill me in. I forget if React VR is even React Native or not, but what is the relationship between React Native for iOS and Android, and then React Native for Windows and other platforms, and React VR? How do those all hook in together?
Sure. I think that's actually a pretty good question. And the way I see it, you'd be surprised to hear, but React VR is actually based on top of React Native. So it's basically a React Native platform. So all the views and all the buttons and all the texts and surfaces, they pretty much are written like view managers that you would write for iOS and Android. So just like an Android view is rendered as a native Android view, or in iOS, it's a native iOS view, it's the same story for React VR also. In fact, React VR sort of has two flavors, I would call it, or sort of two targets. The first one where it renders on a web, letting you do things like web VR, and then actually on the Oculus device. You'd actually be surprised to hear that the React VR web rendering target actually runs React in a web worker, just so that it can simulate React Native as if it's running in a separate thread. And it's based on a slightly olderish version of React Native, but the architecture goes all the way down to the native platform. It's very, very similar. React Native for Windows is also very similar in a sense that it as a platform is at par with React Native Android and React Native iOS. I think Facebook has this grand vision where we want to start thinking about React as a platform, rendering into multiple targets. And I think Tom Okino, who is now the director of the React org, has been talking about this concept of React platform where you have like a top level React rendering mechanism, and that can render into things like the DOM, the DOM or the web, and then iOS, Android, Windows, VR, and multiple other platforms. I think the goal again here is not to be able to share code, but to learn once and run anywhere. And I think that's where this concept of React platform is coming together.
Nice. So I'm going to divert us into React performance and beg you, please come back so we can talk about VR, because I think it's cool. And I think it's a technology that a lot of people are looking at, and may change the way that we interact with things like the web, which is where a lot of React developers live, and then come into the mobile space with React Native. So, but yeah, so React performance. I guess this is one of my pet peeves is when people start talking about performance and they start, nailing it down to, well, I've got it clicking over in, less than 2 milliseconds. And I'm like, okay, but I'm not so fast that 10 milliseconds doesn't make a whole lot of difference to me over 2 milliseconds, right? So when we're measuring performance, how do we measure performance so that it matters to people, right? So that they notice it or don't notice it.
So I think when people talk about performance, there are many things that are involved in performance, and it's going to be hard to make any progress unless we define what it is. And also, just to take a step back here, the theories and the philosophies that I'm applying towards how I improve performance, probably at a philosophical or at a theoretical level, aren't restricted to React or React Native. Back in the day, I used to do a ton of web performance stuff and also Android performance stuff. And all of the principles that I use are basically borrowed from the web world and the Android world. And I think the way to look at it is when you start off, what I like to do is I like to define what performance is. And breaking that down, I try to define what a performance scenario is. So for example, when you say this 2 seconds versus 10 seconds, in abstract, it doesn't make sense. But then if you were to start drilling down and defining it, what would make sense is a 10 millisecond network request is not that big a deal. But a 10 millisecond lag for a click might actually be a big deal. So I think Google Chrome, the developer advocates at Google Chrome have this excellent blog post about what kind of performance matters. And they have this principle called RAIL. I don't remember the exact meaning for the acronym, but I think the rail performance metrics say that certain interactions, if they take longer than a certain period of time, then the application feels laggy. And I think from a performance perspective, it's going to be useful if we talk about, hey, does clicking a button take me 10 milliseconds? Okay, that is bad. But does a network request take me 10 milliseconds? Maybe it's not bad because the entire network is probably like a second or two. Having said that, I think what's important is when we talk about performance, we talk about specific scenarios. And some of the most common scenarios I've seen people use are things like how quickly does the app start up? So what's the app startup time? Or how janky is the scroll, or how smooth is the scroll? Or things like when I navigate between two screens after pressing a button, how quickly can the next screen show up and how smoothly can the next screen show up as soon as I click a button? So to me, that's what performance is when people talk about performance in general.
This reminds me of your talk at Chain React. And if folks aren't familiar, you gave a talk at Chain React conference talking about React Native app performance and what we can do today to improve it. And I just rewatched it a little bit before getting on the recording here. And I loved your intro where you talked about getting the feedback from a coworker, your app sucks. And you went from there, you asked a series of questions to clarify, like, what do you mean? And what is actually going on to get it to be specific and measurable. And I thought that it was really entertaining. And I think it's also really practical because we as developers, whether it's in React Native or elsewhere, get those questions. And so getting to the point of pinning it all on React Native versus in a way that's not measurable or debatable, getting down to the point of let's look at something that's actionable, that's measurable. I thought that was really, really valuable. So thank you for just giving us that model for having a conversation, hopefully not too sarcastic a conversation with our coworkers.
You'd actually be surprised, but though I spun it like a story, it was actually something that was real and that happened to me. So this was a case where there was a real app and a person, not my manager really, but a person actually did come and we went through this series of steps to actually figure out what was going on. So I think this is also a common thing that a lot of React or even general developers notice when they start talking about performance.
Right. And it's like it's easy to get pushback where you say, well, we need to measure it. We need something in place to measure it. And someone can say, well, no, like we don't need to measure this. Like it's obviously slow. Like if anybody pulls it up, like you can tell what is slow. And so I think your story there, your relation of real events gives me the confidence to really push back and say, hey, like I understand, I agree that it feels slow, like, but we need to get specific in order to make progress.
Yeah, I like that too, where you essentially measure it, you put a number on it. Once you have it fixed, right? So it was slow, we figured it out, and now it's fast, right? And so now we can measure it. Now we can look at that response time and we can say, okay, this response time we know is good, and then we can track any regressions on it.
And I think I completely agree with it. In fact, there's this other. So when you were saying this, you also said if it is slow, right? So if you noticed, most of our conversations here start with if the app is slow, and I think that's how developers think of performance. I think we only start addressing performance when things start getting slower, when things start breaking down. I had this quote from Steve Souders, who used to run, or who's like a very popular person in web performance, and he said that performance is a feature. And I agree with that in a sense that rather than having to go back and reactively fix performance, it might actually help to start adding all of these metrics right away. And then if something does go wrong, we at least have a handle on understanding what's going on. So you don't have to fix performance if it's not broken, but you'll at least get an idea of what's going on if you have those instrumentation metrics.
Gotcha. I think I've heard some folks that sometimes say that there should actually be requirements around performance from the start. I'm sure at Facebook that those numbers might be obvious, but like at the smaller organizations that I've worked at, like I would get blank stares if I asked, okay, like tell me how many seconds it should take to load the web page. Like tell me how many frames per second. Well, there's 60 frames per second for the scroll of a list on native is very well known. But other than that, like I think my business owners, the folks setting the requirements, they would not know like what numbers to put around performance from the start. But you didn't say that. Like you talked about having the metrics in place to be able to observe. And I think that's much more reachable to me at the size of companies that I worked at than having people pick performance targets out of the blue from the start.
I agree. And I think that's why I brought up the Rail numbers. So if you look at the Rail documentation, which is probably going to be linked to this podcast, I think that's probably the first time I've actually seen someone put numbers to how does performance impact the user perception of your application. And they talk about different aspects like what happens if the performance is between 0 to 16 seconds and then 0 to 100 seconds versus what happens if you process events greater than 50 milliseconds. So I think to me that's where I use as a reference for numbers, because it's easier to show this document. It's saying, hey, this comes from Google has done a ton of research into this, and they say that, hey, this is the numbers that they have noticed impact users. And I think that's actually a good place to start conversation with your clients.
Yeah, that definitely seems very useful. Great point. I wondered if, kind of going back to your Chain React talk, if it's easy to summarize. I mean, you shared so many different parts of the React Native startup process, and breaking it apart from initialization is slow to get to different pieces of it and how you can optimize, like really practical things you put in place to optimize each. Could you briefly kind of overview like what is involved in the React Native initialization process and what are the different pieces that you looked at in your talk for those who may not have seen it yet?
Sure. So I think the best way to look at React Native is, as we like to joke inside Facebook, no one builds React Native applications. They build mobile, iOS, and Android applications with React Native. I think the key insight there to me was React Native is a framework. It's not like a thing in itself, which means React Native needs to play well with the rest of your system. And that also brings me to how does React Native initialize or what the startup path is. So even before thinking of just the React Native startup path, I think it's important to look at the app startup path as a whole. And I think inside Facebook, that's what we do. We look at, let's take Android for example. And I always love picking on Android because there are so many different types of phones and it's hard to get like those exact numbers. So let's just pick Android again here. So when the Android application starts up, I think the user clicks on the icon, the OS does a whole bunch of things, and then it launches the app, right? So there is a non-trivial amount of work that is being spent from the user clicking the app all the way to your JavaScript being loaded even in the first place. And a lot of them do involve Android. And now I understand that most or a lot of React Native developers or a lot of people who work with React Native don't usually like touching native code, and that's fine. And I think that's where the React Native team is working very hard to improve performance. So some of the things that happen during native startup is, in case of Android, the activity starts up, or the first thing that you see that's called an activity that starts up. The iOS equivalent is called a view controller. So the whole activity or view controller system starts up. And then what happens is, in case of React Native, because React Native is asynchronous, and in a pure React Native application, or a greenfield React Native application as it's called, the React root view is mounted. Now, this root view is basically a full screen canvas on which React can draw its stuff, like do the reconciliation, draw its children and all. So the React root view mounts up, and then this root view is initialized. And as a part of this initialization process, we set up things like the React context, which holds a handle to the React Native bridge. We also set up like all the view managers, view managers are things like buttons and modals and dialogues and all of that. We set those up. And then we set up native modules. Native modules are these pieces of code that React Native uses to interact with your phone. For example, things like the compass or your geolocation or accelerometer. So all of those parts are set up. Then comes the part where your JavaScript virtual machine is set up. And by default, back in the day, the JavaScript virtual machine we used was JSC. Now, iOS is easy because you have system JSC and that's already bundled with your device. But in case of Android, back in the day, we had to actually bundle, recompile JSC for Android and bundle that as a part of your React Native application. Now, JSC, I'm not sure, was very heavily optimized, and there was a non-trivial amount of cost associated with starting the JavaScript virtual machine itself. And now the virtual machine is started, you're going to have to load your JavaScript files from the disk, basically read it from the disk, start parsing it, start executing it. And then as you execute it, that's when your first that's when your app starts up. And that's when you as a user get control to your first registered component that starts rendering stuff. So all of this happens before you even get control of what you can do. Once all of this has happened, the next part is where you as a user have user-facing code that is specific to your application. And it does things like going and asking network requests before rendering the first screen, or showing a loading screen, and then making updates as you start getting network requests back and things like that. So that's basically a longish summary of what happens end to end when you start up React Native.
Yeah, that your point about the fact that it's not really, thinking of it as a React Native application is maybe not the right mental model. Maybe at times it's clearer to think of it as it's an iOS application, it's an Android application written with or in or including React Native, even when it is greenfield. And all the details you get into about what's happening at the native level, optimizations you can do on the native side, definitely makes sense. I have a really big picture question about that. Between your talk and these points just now, it makes me think about the fact that it's like, just reinforcing what so many folks in the community have said, that it's like React Native is not intended to isolate you entirely from the native code. And just to qualify this, because this could sound like a criticism, I'm a huge fan of React Native. I absolutely love it. So this is not a criticism. But it seems to me that it's like, React Native is not a complete abstraction in the sense that it would be, isolating you. Oh, you don't have to touch the native code. You just touch React Native. Oh, you just touch your JavaScript. And even some of your recommendations talked about, like, for example, I think you suggested kicking off network requests in the native platform code for the initial data that your app uses, so that by the time JavaScript starts up, that data will have been loaded in parallel. So I guess my question would be, do you think that makes sense, though, like my assessment that React Native doesn't fully abstract away the native code? And do you think that's an essential part that will always be true of React Native? Or do you think more and more of that will be abstracted away over time?
I think the way I look at it is React Native is no different than writing a code for any other platform. And my favorite comparison is, let's look at the browser, for example, right? So in the browser, back in the day, we only had control over like how we can write web pages. And we really couldn't do anything in terms of, hey, can we actually, so let's say I want to bring up a web page. Technically, though it's just a web page, it's also about like starting up your your browser, like starting up Chrome, for example, and then Chrome starts up, Chrome initializes your JavaScript engine, and then your HTML loads. So I, as a user, in most cases, I only have to worry about my user code, but then it significantly helps me if I understand Chrome's internal process, or if I understand like how Chrome initializes. Of course, I don't have to go understand the code, but what I'm trying to emphasize is getting the concept of how the browser works. So for example, hey, we know that the browser exposes APIs called service workers. Now that can help me cache my request. Or the browser exposes APIs like Web SQL or IndexedDB or local storage. That can help me store data locally. So the point I'm trying to get to is, though we only care about HTML and CSS, there are a ton of browser APIs that are available that if we are aware of, we can actually make use of. React Native is no different. In fact, right now, though there are places where you might have to go write native code, what I've noticed is as people are looking at, hey, that's native code and that's a common pattern, people start abstracting it out. And I mean, browser APIs were also born in that way, right? People said, hey, I wanted a database solution. And then they said, hey, that's a problem that can significantly be abstracted out. And that's why an API came out. So to your point, I think React Native is in a similar boat where people are saying those parts of native look similar. So React navigation is a very good example. People said, hey, native navigation is good. But then guess what? Maybe it's the same pattern that we are using across multiple apps. And that's why React Native navigation that Wix wrote came up. So my assumption is in the future, as people start finding these patterns and as people start investigating in these patterns, we will have enough abstractions where you necessarily don't have to write Objective-C or Java, but it'll still be hugely beneficial if you understand at least what's going on. And then for the superpower users, obviously you definitely want to dive deep in, because this is also one of my favorite parts with React Native. The fact that you're not tied down to just React Native, but can reach into the platform and leverage the platform whenever you want. That's like super useful to me.
Yeah, totally. And, I work with a bunch of native iOS and Android developers. And so there's a lot of knowledge there and books and courses that we have at Big Nerd Ranch. And so this not mean to be an advertisement, but like for me and for others, like checking those out to get a basic sense of knowledge of the platform is very useful. At the same time, some of the resources you learn when you're learning to build native iOS and Android apps, you're not necessarily getting way under the hood as far as like initialization and things like that. So I guess one question I would have is, for someone who wanted to go deep into the native platform and understand some of the things that you understand, to the people that are trying to solve these problems in a reusable way, like, do you have any recommendations for what would be a good way to understand iOS and Android under the hood, or to understand the React Native framework under the hood and what's happening at that level? Things other than just, here's how I put my components together and how I use hooks. Like, what are good ways to get under the hood for those platforms?
I think the easiest way was, or the best way is to obviously read the code, but I also understand that that's not the most optimal way. I think what's happening is we now finally have Rachel on our team who's going to be helping us write documentation, and she's amazing because she's actually written really good documentation for some really large scale projects, and I'm hoping that all of this information is now distilled and documented into the main React Native website. In fact, as we are speaking, there is also the new React Native website that was launched today. And the reason why we are doing all of this is we want to document all of this. But till the documentation happens, I think the way I learned it personally was I'm a web developer. I come from a web development background. I had never written Java or Objective-C after college. And that's like a billion years ago. So my exposure to this was, I looked at what people were doing at Facebook, and people are like, hey, the problem there was this part of React Native was slow. Okay, what can we do? And then just because something was written in Java or Objective-C did not stop a web engineer from diving deep. And that's one lesson I learned. So they were like, okay, I see that this part is written in Java and it's slow. So maybe I just go jump in and learning a language, you don't have to be an expert in that language to go understand what's happening. And that's basically the approach I took. The other thing that also helped me a lot is asking people. I think the React Native core contributors are super friendly. And when I was starting up, I was actually bugging a lot of them, trying to understand how the whole thing works, what the architecture is. And the React Native team has also been stepping up on doing a lot more tech talks and a lot more deep dives on how things work. There have been like a bunch of tech talks about turbo modules, about Fabric, about React Instance Manager. There's also a big talk coming up by Emily Janser on like the React Instance Manager at React Native EU. So those talks have been super useful. And I think to me, that level of understanding gives me an idea of, okay, this is what's happening. And then using that as a starting point, I was able to jump into the code.
I'm glad you mentioned Rachel getting started. I saw her tweet recently asking for input and feedback on the docs and the ways to make things better. I know with the way that Facebook tends to work with the community, it's ideal for React Native when things benefit Facebook and their applications as well as benefiting the community. So the benefits of Rachel documenting this stuff are very clear for all of us out here. What are the benefits of her documentation for folks at Facebook?
Folks at Facebook are no different from folks outside. So except the React Native core team, apart from the React Native core team, there are many more people in Facebook who use React Native. And not all of them are familiar with the internals of React Native, right? So for example, there's the Oculus companion app, and that's written completely in React Native. That is actually a greenfield app, no different from any other community greenfield app. And the story is, if an engineer there wants to go improve performance, we need documentation for that. And at that point, if you're writing documentation, why not just make it available to the public? So I think the goal here is very similar to why React was open source or why React Native was open source. It's a problem that we have. We are solving it for ourselves, and we believe that it will also help the community.
That definitely makes sense.
When I'm building a new product, G2I is the company that I call on to help me find a developer who can build the first version. G2I is a hiring platform run by engineers that matches you with React, React Native, GraphQL, and mobile engineers who you can trust. Whether you are a new company building your first product or an established company that wants additional engineering help, G2I has the talent you need to accomplish your goals. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about what G2I has to offer. In my experience, G2I has linked up with experienced developers that can fit my budget, and the G2I staff are friendly and easy to work with. They know how product development works and can help you find the perfect engineer for your stack. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about G2I. So one thing that I'm driving at, because you've talked a bit about how the app gets bootstrapped and how your components get put together and all of this stuff, and you start looking at some of these performance issues. How do you take this knowledge, or how do you approach some of this information when you just realize that, hey, it's not scrolling, it looks funny, or hey, when I tap this button, it's not responding fast enough, or things like that. How do you tie the two together, I guess? And how do you make it so that there's an action that you can take to make it better?
So I think the approach I've been taking is mostly dividing this into two phases. So the phase one is about instrumenting, or about getting all of that information. And then tying that to phase two is basically using experiments. So let's say there's a button and that doesn't respond quickly. I then start looking at, hey, what's actually happening in the button? And there could be a lot of things, like the button could be really expensive. It could be rendering a whole new things. And in React Native, in the React Native documentation, there are actually ways that tell you how can you fix scrolling. So for example, let's say you have a long list and you notice that the lists are not working well. The first thing I do is I go look at the documentation for lists. And more often than not, I actually find what's happening on the list. For example, in case of lists, there are these tricks around when should a list update, or how can it be virtualized and stuff. And it's all there in the documentation. Now, me being a lazy developer, I probably would have skipped over those sections because they were not relevant when I was building a list. But now that the list scrolling is actually slow, I can go down and start looking at the exact usage of list and props. And I try to structure those around experiments. So what I do is have an A/B test where I have the original list and then I have these changes that I've modified. And that way I'm also able to confirm that the way I was using the list was incorrect, and the new changes that I have in my list seem to make sense.
So you're talking about things in the list that, yeah, you go look at the documentation, it's like, okay, I should be doing these things. But what about some of the other stuff where it's not quite as clear? Maybe it's a network request, or maybe it's a it's some algorithm that I am using in my setup, that may not be optimized. How do you track those kinds of things down? Or maybe I've got a component that's not, playing nicely.
So I think there are tools for each one of those cases. So let's take those cases one after the other. So let's start with networking. And as far as networking is concerned, the first question that I ask is, do we really need to do it at startup? And as people often say, being lazy is good. So the question is, hey, can we make the network lazy? Can we make the network show up only after the app starts up? In our case, what we do is we use Relay, and we have the Relay developer tools that tell us when the network requests are made. Now, if you're using something like Apollo or AWS AppSync, you have tools for those also. And what you would typically do is figure out what's happening and what part of network is slow. Is it the fact that you're making the network request too late in the game, or is it that the network on the server is taking too long? Or it could be that the amount of data that the network is sending me could be huge. So using tools, we actually start drilling deeper into all of these, and we'll start getting information about what exactly is going on. And then depending on what we find, we could say, hey, maybe the network is sending too much data, so the server should not send as much data. Or this probably is the fact that, hey, the server itself is taking way too long to respond. So maybe we should make the server faster, or maybe we should start caching that request. Or the fact that we are making this request too late in the game, can we move this request to an earlier component that will help us get started faster? So that's the case of network. Now let's take the case of a component that takes too long. For that, my favorite tool is the React Profiler. So if you have React greater than 16.5, you can attach the DevTools, and then one of the tabs in the DevTools is called a React Profiler. Brian Wan has written a very good article and also done a screencast on how to diagnose component issues. So what I do is I fire up my profiler, start performing the actions that I want to, for example, clicking a button and stuff. And the React Profiler tells me which prop was updated, why did a component get re-rendered, what was the state change, what was the prop change, and how long it took. And that way, what you can do is you can also order by what is the most expensive component, and start drilling deeper and figure out why was that rendered. And once you figure that out, you can start adding things like should component update or pure functions, where you say, I do not care about this update, so I don't want my entire tree to re-render just because this unrelated prop or unrelated state change. And that's basically has been my approach.
I'm starting to see a big picture emerge here, and it gets to the fact that you talked about theories and philosophies of performance improvement that you shared earlier in our conversation. I think for me as a developer, performance testing and improvement has always felt scary, partially because it's so fuzzy. Like if I need to build a feature, either I've built it or I haven't. And if I'm either getting an error or I'm not. So those are very concrete things I can look into. But performance can seem very fuzzy. I was performance optimizing a web application I just deployed to production last week. And it was like, oh, well, this is sometimes slow, but it's sometimes not. And it's not a huge audience, so we don't have tons of instrumentation in place. So just performance has always felt very fuzzy and scary to me. But some of the takeaways I'm hearing from what you're saying are, you shared some specific heuristics or approaches to take. Like, what if we can do this lazily and load it later? But beyond those specifics, I think there's just this general point I'm getting of make it concrete. Like, don't just kind of flail in the dark of performance and just try something and see if it feels like it's better, but make it measurable, take steps to improve it, measure it to see if it happened. And I think another takeaway that I personally have from this is just an encouragement to me, and I hope our listeners feel this way as well, that of confidence, that you can do it. Like, you can learn performance techniques in general. You can learn how these platforms work in particular. You can dig into some native code even if you've never touched it before, and you'll get something away from it. Like you should really try it. You can do it. So those are some of the big takeaways that I'm taking from what you're saying, and it seems very helpful to me.
I agree, and I think the other point that I've also been learning is debugging performance is no different from debugging a general functional bug. The only difference is that more often than not, performance regressions are like those bugs that are not reproducible easily. So when you're debugging, it's easy to set a breakpoint, and if the bug is reproducible, it's easy. But then the moment there are race conditions and stuff, it's hard, right? Most performance issues fall in that second category, and I think that's what kind of sets a barrier to entry when people start working on performance. And I'm hoping that the best way to solve these race condition bugs or these non-reproducible bugs is using tooling and trying to measure and trying to make them reproducible. Performance has the same story, and it's all these tooling and making the whole thing reproducible that's going to help us go fix those performance issues.
You mentioned earlier that these techniques and philosophies you're using aren't specific to React Native. For folks that want to get more into knowing about performance in general, are there books, are there conference talks or online courses that you could recommend about just kind of learning about a performance philosophy?
So I think while I was working on web performance, one of my favorites back in the day was when there was Yahoo's performance roadmap, and Steve Souders used to be from Yahoo, and there were tons of documentation about how Yahoo was making their things fast. And I think the next version of that to me is the web performance documentation, the Rail documentation that Google has. So that's actually a good place to start looking at from a philosophical perspective. And then once you go down that, as you look at each of your platforms, as you look at the web versus React Native versus even native Android, I think each of them have their own specific documentation or specific pages where they talk about performance. Now, I know that books are easier to understand and comprehend than like documents or just like web pages written for that specific framework. But those pages for specific frameworks might actually be a good start. Like if you read through them, you may not understand the whole thing, but that'll actually be a good place to start investigating, digging, and trying to understand what's going on.
Well, and the fact that I move between platforms in my development a lot, the perspective you've given me that you can get these general principles and they apply everywhere is super motivating. If I have a specific React Native performance issue in my app that I'm working through, it's motivating to know that the things I learn are going to apply on the web. They're going to apply across iOS and Android, even if the techniques I use to measure them are different. So that's more motivating to me to take the time to learn it. I have a few sort of tangent questions before we wrap up for the day. I joked with you after the talk that you had those Clippy animations. You put the time into those. I'm curious if you actually yourself made the Clippy animations, or if you had a team member or a friend that worked on those for you.
So I picked up some of the frames of the Clippy animations from the internet. But to be honest, I think for my talk, I probably spent way too much time, like much more time on the Clippy animations itself than the content of the talk. I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but hey, Clippy always makes people smile. So I guess it did that job.
Yeah. Well, newer developers that don't know, we need to keep the knowledge of Clippy alive so everyone can experience it.
That is true.
All the baby developers out there that were too young to have used Word way back in the day.
Yeah.
You'd actually be surprised, but one of my teammates who just graduated out of college saw the talk and asked me what Clippy was.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Before the talk, before the conversation, we were talking, I was asking about what you were doing with Oculus, and you mentioned some research into Oculus for kind of 2D visualization. You want to share a bit about what you're doing there?
Oh, definitely. And I think this also touches Chuck's question about the killer application. And Chuck, you know what the killer application for Oculus in my mind is?
I'd love
it's actually, you'd be surprised, but it's actually a virtual desktop. So what I do, I know this is taking it to a little extreme, but hear me out. At my work, I have one of those Dell curved monitors, and I thought that was good for like writing code and stuff. But what I noticed was better is using virtual desktop on your Oculus device. So there's this app called Virtual Desktop, which projects your screen on the Oculus device, and you can continue using your mouse and keyboard regularly. So these days, what I do is I actually have my Oculus device on and have the virtual desktop, which makes it like a massive screen when I start typing. So this whole idea of projecting a monitor up and using, so it's a massive, like a home theater kind of a display for writing code. And the best part is you don't even waste any physical space. So what I was trying to do was I was trying to take that idea further. And my wife is a dental radiologist, which means she spends most of her time reading radiographs. Now, one day she came home and she said that she wanted a large monitor so that it can help her read the radiographs better or read the X-rays better. And I wanted that space to play games, like play Oculus games. So we stuck a compromise, and I have set up this virtual desktop for her where she actually sits at a desk, has a computer and mouse and the Oculus device on, and she can use that setup and then have like a pretend 3D virtual desktop where she reads all of her stuff. So what I'm excited about is her looking at X-rays in this massive screen that's in the virtual reality. But what I'm working on as a side project these days is trying to take that visualization and converting that to 3D, because why not? I mean, Oculus and VR is all about 3D. So why read X-rays in 2D when you can try to combine multiple X-rays and try to read them in 3D? So that's the research project that I'm working on right now as a hobby thing and trying to see how that'll come up with. At work, I'm specifically working on the Oculus companion app and AR React VR stuff for like stuff that is displayed on the Oculus headset.
I'm glad you mentioned this about the virtual desktop, because I've had a bit of a preconception against the approach. People saying, oh, you can watch a movie in VR. Well, why don't I just watch it on my TV screen? But I think I'm learning more about just kind of, not at a deep level, but just how like the human brain and perception works, and just the fact that like getting a bigger monitor doesn't always help. And the fact that like our brains are made to be able to look around and like visualize things in 3D space. So the idea that I might be able to just glance left and right and look at different things that I'm working on, like I think our brains are made to be able to do that. So whereas I've had this preconception that it was a silly idea in the past, I think you've convinced me to give it more of a shot, and that it may really resonate with the way our brains work.
Mm-hmm. And I think these days I don't even watch Netflix on my TV. I watch Netflix on my Oculus headsets, because it's like sitting at a home theater without having to pay for the entire home theater.
Yep, I really want to play with it now. All right. Well, I've got another call coming up, so I'm going to push us into picks. Josh, do you have some picks for us?
I sure do. Let me get them up here. So a couple of things I have to share this week. There's a book I got on recommendation from Twitter called Why We Sleep, and talking about some of the research behind sleep. And I've been a big believer in work-life balance and getting enough rest. And I've seen that play out as far as being able to make more of a difference and deliver more value in my projects when I'm not doing 60, 80-hour days on an ongoing basis. But I wanted to be able to back that up with research. And so this book is really helpful to get into. I found that a lot of research on sleep is only in the last couple of decades that people have really learned a lot of things about how sleep works and why it works. So it's really interesting. I'm just getting started. The other recommendation is a game. Again, I found it's for iOS and for Android. It's called Nonstop Night 2. And I've played a lot of RPGs, Diablo back in the day. And I've tried to find games like that for mobile. Some of them are better than others. But this one's great. I've got a baby now, and so this one I can play one-handed while I'm holding him or feeding him with the other hand. But it still feels substantial. It still feels like I'm fighting monsters and leveling up and getting more gear. So it's really entertaining. I really like it. Those are my picks.
Nice. I'm going to jump in with a couple of picks. So one pick, my family, we went down to Texas to visit my brother-in-law. Their son was getting baptized. So we made the trip, and a few things that made the trip a little bit nice. One is the Nintendo DS. I have 5 kids, and so my kids were all playing on their video games, and that was super nice. So I'm going to pick the Nintendo DS. And then one other thing that I'm going to pick, and it's kind of just a fun thing that we ran into. My sister-in-law she likes jigsaw puzzles, and I really enjoy them as well. So she pulled one out, and it was made by a company called Eurographics. They also sell posters and things like that, but their puzzles are awesome. And this one had like a couple dozen different kinds of cupcakes with different decorations on them. And it was a lot of fun to put together. They have a whole bunch of other ones, all kinds of stuff. They have the more scientific ones. So they have the solar system and the periodic table and the atom and, things like that. But they've also got like different Christmas treats and chocolate treats and, stuff like that for just that you can put together. And anyway, just fun puzzles. So I'm going to pick those as well, the Eurographics puzzles. Ram, do you have some picks for us?
I think I have two, though not as exciting as the picks that you guys had. The first one was, I'd like to give a shout out to the new website for React Native and the entire effort around documenting React Native, the whole documentation effort. If people who are listening to this radio have ideas and suggestions or want to contribute, documentation is probably the easiest way to contribute into open source. So please do reach out to the React Native team, and we'd love to get your contributions or hear you out. So my pick is the React Native website, which is now completely redesigned, and the React Native documents. And my second pick is just a message telling people to be nice to each other. I was recently at a conference where I heard some really nasty comments about like my accent and where I was from, and it was not super healthy, or it was not super useful. I mean, we were having a good conversation, or at least that's what I thought. And then suddenly there was a snarky comment about how come I was working on this. So I'm not sure if being not nice to people is really useful or helpful. The message here is, hey, let's all be nice to each other so that we can solve real world computer problems rather than fight each other.
That's an extremely important pick. That's great.
Yep, I agree. It's also interesting because if you're forming opinions about people based on how they look or how they sound or things like that, you're going to miss out on all of the other interesting things that they have to offer that can enrich your life. So do yourself a favor and be nice to other people. All right, Ram, if people want to find you online, where do they go?
I'm usually very active on Twitter, and my DMs on Twitter are open. So I have my Twitter handle posted as a part of this episode. My website is also open, so people can hit me up either on Twitter or on my website. It's nparshuram.com.
Nice. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this one up. Thank you both for coming, and we will be back next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.